The Ugly Duckling. Once upon a time on a sunny farm, a mother duck was incubating her eggs by the pond. Eventually, the eggshells cracked open, and one by one, 6 ducklings emerged. Their feathers were golden and fluffy, and as they quacked and waddled, they looked so adorable. They swam and played with their mother, their laughter filling the air as if it were the melody of the entire farm. However, among these innocent little ducklings, there was one that was different. This duckling's feathers were not golden, but gray with some mottled patches. It was also slightly clumsier than the others, walking slowly and jumping lower. Whenever it tried to join in the games of the other ducklings, they would laugh at it and avoid it. "Oh, you're so clumsy. Stop causing trouble," one duckling would mock. Other ducklings would look at it disdainfully and say, "Look at you, how could you ever have friends?" These words pierced the ugly duckling's heart like sharp arrows. It even felt as though the very air it breathed had become heavy. Whenever it approached the pond, the other ducklings would always move away, as if it were an unwelcome guest. The mother duck, though always gentle with it, could not help but wonder, why was it so different? Why couldn't it have a happy childhood like the others? "Mother, why am I so ugly? Why can't I be popular like them?" One day, the ugly duckling couldn't hold back and asked its mother. The mother duck lowered her head, looking into its eyes filled with confusion and sadness, and softly replied, "My dear, appearance doesn't determine everything. What matters is the courage and kindness in your heart. Sometimes time will make everything clearer, and you will understand." However, the ugly duckling didn't fully understand the mother duck's words. It only felt that the gap between itself and the other ducklings was growing larger, and the innate sense of loneliness was becoming stronger. Every time it tried to join the group of ducklings, it was always pushed aside. This made its heart become even more closed off. It began to endure loneliness and the pain of being forgotten. Every night, when the other ducklings cuddled up to their mother, the ugly duckling always lay alone in the corner, its heart filled with an indescribable sense of solitude. One morning, when the mother duck took all the ducklings out for a walk, the ugly duckling was once again pushed aside by the others. That day, everyone was playing by the pond, chasing each other, and the water splashes were like countless sparkling pearls blooming under the sun. Meanwhile, the ugly duckling stood silently on the side, quietly watching them. Suddenly, one duckling rolled over and bumped into another, and they laughed and played together, while the ugly duckling was once again ignored. It lowered its head, feeling full of disappointment and resentment. It tried to walk towards the water, hoping to join the game, but each time, it was interrupted by the laughter and mockery of the other ducklings. "You're so big, don't disturb us," one duckling said coldly. "You're so ugly, what are you doing here?" Another duckling also sneered. The ugly duckling stood to the side, unable to bear the sharp words, and there was a faint glimmer of tears in its eyes. The mother duck saw this and felt great sorrow in her heart. She walked over and gently stroked the ugly duckling's head, saying softly, "My dear, the opinions of others don't matter. What matters is that you believe in yourself. One day, these pains will pass, and you will find your own sky." However, the ugly duckling's heart was not comforted by this. It still felt there was an insurmountable gap between itself, the mother duck, and the other ducklings. Days passed by, and the other ducklings remained lively and cheerful, while the ugly duckling's sense of loneliness grew stronger. Every time it saw its reflection in the water, its feelings of inferiority and sadness became more intense. Finally, on a dull evening, the ugly duckling made a decision. That day, the clouds were thick in the sky, and the darkened heavens seemed to resonate with its endless loneliness. The farm pond shimmered in the cold wind, and the air was filled with a damp chill. It looked once more at the ducklings, who no longer had any connection with it, and the indescribable pain surged within its heart again. It could no longer endure this life. Every time it tried to fit in, it was relentlessly pushed away. It no longer wished to rely on anyone's pity, nor wait for some miraculous change. Perhaps nothing would ever change. It would wait no longer. It had to leave this land to find a place of its own, to find its own sky. The ugly duckling made up its mind completely. It no longer looked back. It silently bid farewell to the pond, to the mother, and to the familiar land. Even though its heart was filled with anxiety and fear, it walked forward steadily, carrying endless hope and sadness, embarking on an unknown journey. As the days passed, the ugly duckling walked through countless fields and forests, facing various challenges and adventures. At every turn of the journey, it encountered new friends, as well as some not-so-friendly creatures. These experiences made its spirit grow stronger and stronger. One day, the ugly duckling arrived at a dense forest, where the trees stood tall and proud, and sunlight filtered through the gaps in the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air here was fresh, and the sound of birds chirping filled the air. However, as the ugly duckling strolled peacefully, it suddenly heard a rustling sound coming from the bushes. It stopped in its tracks and looked around cautiously. Suddenly, a brown fox leaped out of the bushes and quickly approached the ugly duckling. The fox's eyes sparkled, and a sly smile curled at the corners of its mouth. It said softly, "Little duck, you're so lonely. Why don't you come with me? This forest is vast, and there's plenty of food waiting for you." The ugly duckling felt a wave of fear. It wasn't unaware that the fox was a dangerous predator, but it couldn't help asking, "Do you really want to help me?" The fox narrowed its eyes and flashed a smug smile. Of course, who wouldn't want a tender and delicious little duck like you? The ugly duckling immediately understood the fox's intention. It turned and ran into the depths of the forest. Although its speed was not fast, it ran as fast as it could, its heart pounding as if it would leap out of its chest. The fox chased after it, its steps light and quick, closing in with each stride, and it looked as if it was about to catch the ugly duckling. At the critical moment, the ugly duckling noticed a stream ahead, with fast-moving water. Without hesitation, it jumped into the stream, letting the water carry it away. The fox, seeing this, didn't dare to leap into the rushing water and could only stop at the edge of the stream, letting out an unwilling cry. The ugly duckling drifted in the water for a long while, eventually stopping at the bank further downstream. Gasping for breath, it climbed out of the water. Its heart was still racing, but it couldn't help feeling a little proud of its own cleverness. It realized that it was no longer the helpless, ugly duckling, but a brave little life that could survive by relying on its own wit. A few days later, the ugly duckling arrived at another meadow. The sun was shining brightly, the grass was lush and green, and there were a few rabbits hopping around in the grass. It decided to rest here for a while and relax its tense mind. Just as it was feeling peaceful and calm on the meadow, a young rabbit hopped over. Its ears were long, and its eyes were bright and lively, looking full of energy. "Hey, hello," the rabbit said to the ugly duckling in an energetic tone. The ugly duckling looked up at the rabbit and politely replied, "Hello. It's so quiet here. Perfect for resting." The rabbit giggled, hopped to the ugly duckling's side, and started examining it. "You look different. Are you a duckling?" The ugly duckling smiled. Although it knew it was different from other ducklings, it no longer felt as inferior as before. "Yes, I am a duckling, but I've been traveling." The rabbit's eyes widened, looking very curious. "Wow, that must have been interesting. Where have you been?" The ugly duckling thought for a moment and began sharing its adventures with the rabbit. It told the story of escaping from a fox and how it had to find food and water on its own in the forest. The rabbit listened attentively, its eyes full of wonder and admiration. "You're such a brave duckling," the rabbit exclaimed. "I've always lived on this meadow and have never seen so much of the world. Maybe one day, I'll be able to leave this familiar place, just like you." Hearing the rabbit's words, the ugly duckling felt a warm feeling in its heart. Although it had always felt distant from other animals, it now understood that every life has its unique value and meaning. It smiled and said, "Every place has its beauty, and the important thing is that we must be brave to pursue and discover it." The rabbit looked at the ugly duckling, nodded, and its eyes were full of respect. It bounced a little, then suddenly stopped, as if remembering something, and asked, "Where are you going?" The ugly duckling gazed at the distant sky, took a deep breath, and answered, "I don't know yet, but I believe I will find a place that belongs to me." The rabbit smiled broadly upon hearing this. "I wish you find your sky soon," it said loudly, waving its paw. The ugly duckling responded gratefully, and then turned to continue on its journey. This time, it no longer felt alone, because it knew that wherever it went, it would meet kind friends like the rabbit, and its heart no longer felt so lonely. As time passed, the ugly duckling continued to wander in this unfamiliar world. Each encounter with animals made its spirit stronger. It gradually understood that no matter what had happened in the past, it always had the power to choose and the strength to become stronger. Every adventure, whether facing a dangerous fox or chatting with a cute rabbit, helped the ugly duckling slowly piece together a brand new version of itself. It was no longer the gray duckling that had been mocked, but a life full of courage, wisdom, and hope. The ugly duckling had traveled through countless fields and forests. Whenever it was tired, It would rest under a tree and look up at the unfamiliar sky. Occasionally, it would stop to look at its reflection on the water, noticing that the gray duckling still followed it like a shadow. A hint of bitterness would often rise in its heart, but every time, it reminded itself that all the pain would eventually be rewarded. A storm quietly approached, and the dark sky seemed to devour all the light. The strong wind howled, and the rain pierced the ugly duckling's feathers like needles. It struggled to find a small shelter in the forest, curled up to maintain a little warmth. But even so, it could not escape the loneliness in its heart. The storm did not end there but became even fiercer, with thunder roaring and lightning splitting the dark sky. Can I really keep going? The ugly duckling silently asked itself. It felt incredibly tired, as though it was about to give up. However, it took a deep breath and looked up at the thunderous sky. It remembered what its mother duck had once told it. Sometimes the opinions of others don't matter. What's important is the courage and faith in your heart. These words were like a key that opened the closed door in its heart. Thus, the ugly duckling stood up resolutely in the midst of the storm, shook off the rain, and continued to move forward. It knew that no matter how difficult it was, it had to keep walking this path. One day, when the ugly duckling arrived at a tranquil lake, it stood by the shore and took a deep breath of fresh air. The water was crystal clear, and the surrounding trees were lush and abundant. At that moment, it suddenly heard a crisp call. When it looked up, a group of white swans was gracefully gliding across the lake. Their feathers were as white as snow, their necks long, and their movements light and elegant. The swans moved through the water, occasionally dipping their heads to feed or flapping their wings, exuding a sense of unparalleled tranquility and nobility. The ugly duckling looked at the swans, and a strong emotion surged within it. It felt as though it had glimpsed a certain future, a beautiful possibility. It silently watched the swans, their dazzling appearance and graceful posture, causing it to feel an uncontrollable sense of envy. That's how I want to be, thought the ugly duckling, a glimmer of longing and wonder flashing in its eyes. It no longer saw itself as just an ugly duckling, but felt the power of change within itself. Just then, one of the swans turned its head and noticed the ugly duckling. It gently swam toward the shore, gazing at the ugly duckling with warm eyes, as if saying, "You will find your place, find your own feathers." The ugly duckling was stunned. That day, it stayed quietly by the lake for a long time, watching the swans glide elegantly on the water. It felt an unprecedented excitement and calmness, and a vague, indescribable emotion welled up in its heart. It understood that this lake, these swans, represented the future it longed for, a place that belonged to it, a more beautiful and powerful version of itself. When the swan swam toward the ugly duckling again, it looked down and realized that it was still a gray duckling, its feathers still not smooth enough, and its neck still not long enough. A feeling of disappointment washed over it, but it quickly reminded itself, "Every life has its process, and I have not yet reached the end." It looked back at the path it had traveled, those lonely, difficult days, and the friends and foes it had encountered along the way. It began to understand that these experiences had shaped the person it was today, and had made it more determined that it would one day shine in its own light. Months later, spring finally arrived. The ugly duckling still persisted on its long journey, having experienced countless difficulties and challenges. Whenever it felt like giving up, it would think of the distant blue sky and the sense of freedom and hope that belonged to it. It had begun to get used to loneliness and had learned how to survive in this unfamiliar world. Finally, on a quiet morning, when the sunlight filtered through the thin clouds and shone on the earth, the ugly duckling arrived at a vast lake. The water was clear, and it was surrounded by lush green trees and grass. This place was not as noisy as any other place, and the air was filled with the fragrance of flowers. As it walked closer to the shore and looked down at its reflection in the water, it was stunned. This time, the ugly duckling noticed a remarkable change. Its feathers had turned pure white and smooth, its neck had become much longer, and its eyes shimmered with a natural elegance. It suddenly realized that it had become the swan it had once envied so much. "I've changed," the ugly duckling whispered, a surge of indescribable joy filling its heart. It knew that this wasn't by chance, but that the effort and persistence along the way had led it to complete its transformation. It was no longer the duckling that was mocked, but a swan with strength and beauty, with its own wings. Just as the ugly duckling was experiencing this joy, it heard a familiar call. It looked up and saw the group of swans swimming toward it. They danced gracefully on the water, gently flapping their wings as if welcoming a new member into their ranks. One of the swans swam toward it and gently asked, "Are you?" The ugly duckling smiled and replied, "I am one of you." Then, it lightly flapped its wings and glided alongside the swans on the surface of the lake, feeling the freedom and lightness. From that moment on, the ugly duckling was no longer lonely, nor was it misunderstood or rejected. It had become a graceful swan, soaring through the blue sky with the other swans, gliding over the green lake. Its heart was filled with boundless joy and tranquility. The loneliness and pain from before seemed to vanish in that moment, replaced by a newfound confidence and brilliance. In that moment, the ugly duckling understood. The loneliness and pain it had once experienced were all meant to help it transform into who it was today. It realized that these challenges were the nutrients that shaped its courage and persistence. It no longer looked back, but spread its wings and glided gracefully over the lake, soaring elegantly in the peaceful sky. This is the story of the ugly duckling, a tale of a duckling who was ignored and mocked but transformed into a confident and beautiful swan. It was not only a physical transformation but also a spiritual growth. Through its experience, it tells us that every life, no matter how insignificant, has the potential to become the most beautiful version of itself. As long as we persist in our beliefs, go through difficulties and challenges, we will ultimately see our own light. The story teaches us that the judgments of others do not matter. What truly matters is our belief in ourselves and our hope for the future. Every fall, every challenge, will make us stronger and bring us closer to our ideals. And ultimately, the laughter and loneliness that once hurt us will become the nutrients for our growth, helping us become the best version of ourselves.